Dr. Stephen Blackwood, welcome to the podcast.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
So I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and Ralston College. But before we do that, I did want to provide some background. So not only you know where I'm coming from, but so audiences can kind of get a sense of why we're having this conversation. I've been following the exploits of Ralston College for some time and have been extraordinarily impressed with the work you're doing, particularly, I know you have a humanities degree, but in the connection that you all are doing with the arts and humanities. In the United States, I think it's fair to say that there's been a lot of skepticism when it comes to higher education, college institutions. And Ralston is filling, at least from my perspective, a much needed gap in higher education. So if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, what it is that you do, but also what Ralston College is.
You betcha. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, my name is Stephen Blackwood. I'm the founding president of Ralston College. It's a new institution of higher education in Savannah, Georgia. Before that, I had spent a good bit of time, let's say, thinking about certain fundamental questions that define human culture and human experience. I'm a scholar of Boethius, the late antique Roman philosopher, poet, politician, inventor, and I've spent a good bit of time with the ancients and medievals. I've done some teaching, worked in various nonprofit spheres, and came with a group of people to the idea that rather than complain about the problems in higher education or simply write about or talk about those problems, that we would try and do something positive, and that there was an opportunity to go back to basics or to build from first principles or from fundamentals in terms of what a university is, what higher education properly conceived should be. But maybe more important than those things that sort of sound like abstractions, the aim was to think about what a certain kind of young person today who wants a higher education, what they're hungry for, what is transformative for them, what they're really looking for. How do you do right by those people? And though I do think there are some pretty significant problems in higher education, and I've talked and written about those, so I haven't pulled my punches in that regard. On the one hand, on the other hand, one of my abiding and deepest convictions, I think that's shared by my colleagues, is that you can only build from a positive vision. And so criticism is best if it's made out of love. You might say this play was okay, but it would have been better had they done this. And this is an effort to try, within the limitations we have, to honor what we think is most important in a higher education. So we're a new college. We're in Savannah, Georgia. We offer one program at the moment. It's a one-year master's degree. You can consider it a kind of a boot camp. It goes through 4 terms or quarters. The first of those is in Greece. It's an immersive Greek program. Let me tell you, it is the adventure of a lifetime. The students show up on the island of Samos, and they work very, very hard. We try to keep the dial turned up to a 12 or 13 out of 10. So they're working extremely hard in their Greek in an immersive context, but also in an extremely inspiring and beautiful landscape at the edge of the Aegean. But even more important than that, in a community that is able to experience together some of the great sites at the origin of Western civilization. They go to Pythagoras' cave and to the cave of Patmos, where St. John was inspired with revelation. They visit Delphi and Olympia and so on. And so all of that is to say that it starts in Greece with this really immersive moment that's meant to light the fire. And then they come to Savannah for the next 3 quarters or terms, and they continue their study of Greek, but that becomes the maybe 40% or so of what they're doing, and the rest of their time they are reading and writing their way through the history and evolution, the ideas and ideals of Western civilization, and that in Savannah goes through 3 8-week terms, ancient, medieval, modern, and then at the end of that they take double blind graded examinations in both the Greek and philosophy and literature streams of the program, and are graded to, if I may say so, quite a high standard. And if and only if they pass those double-blind graded examinations, they attend graduation and are admitted to the degree of Master of Arts. So that's the first program we have. That's what we are doing now. We're looking to do something as well as we possibly can, and then to build from that through other programs that we think would be that we would be good at offering, and that there is a need for in our time in history.
Well, this is one of the reasons I was really excited to talk to you. So, in the first 10 episodes of this podcast, I ended each episode with the question, what is a positive vision for the future that you, in the case of the guest, or in the case of the guest rather, would like to manifest? And it's always from that position of criticism is easy. What are you actually doing to change things? Which is what's so cool about Ralston. Now, I do want to ask you, and this is going to sound a little bit weird, but I want to come at this from a negative position first. Um, and I'm going to use this term broadly. It's not true writ large, but it's true enough that I'd like to ask you. There is a growing movement on the, let's say, conservative audience, small c, large c, that looks at higher education, especially something like a humanities degree, with a lot of skepticism. He's not a TikToker, but Charlie Kirk was gone around and has made a lot of noise saying that we need to just bulldoze the universities. We don't need these higher institutions. The best thing that you can do is get an engineering degree, a law degree, a medical degree, and all of those things are important. But I wanted to ask you, as you are the president and founder of Ralston, why is not only higher education important, but a quote unquote useless degree like the humanities important?
Great question. If I may, I'll approach that from a couple of different angles. The first is that I believe it would be a mistake to take either of the extremes at the moment. And one would be to bulldoze everything we have, and the other would be to say we can only work with what we have. I think that we need to be more nuanced than that. We need to both admit there are serious problems and try to repair them internally as best as we can. It would be nihilist, I think, to give up on the great institutions of our time and culture. On the one hand. On the other hand, I think it's very important that we think outside the box, so to speak, and we do what our forebears did. We plant new trees. We light new candles. We transmit we transmit the perennial truths and insights and lessons in whatever creative ways we can possibly find. And so I think that actually the paradox of continuity is birth and rebirth. And so I think that it's a profoundly small c conservative thing to conserve by creating. And so I think, conservatism as an ossified preservation of the past, I just don't believe in that. I don't actually think that how you preserve anything. Once it becomes ossified, it breaks. The paradox of tradition is actually, the word tradition comes from the Latin trado tradere, which means to hand over like a baton. And if you think about a handing over of a tradition, it could be your family customs at Christmas. It could be anything that you do in your family or town or in any club or college you're part of. That handing on is a dynamic, creative activity, and so it only works when by in fact giving it to the next person, and that doesn't happen simply on autopilot. So what I'm trying to say here is that yes, I think there are major problems. Yes, I think we should try to reform from within, but we should also admit that our efforts to do so have largely been failures, and that therefore the sensible thing to do, and this is where I've put my money, so to speak, is in starting new things as best we can with the lights, to the best of our lights, to the best of our resources. When you have a bottleneck over here, perhaps the thing to do is to open up some more room for travel somewhere else, and not to be fatalists. Oh, well, we can never do anything about this. Well, damn well we can, and let's do it. And people have done it in the past who had way less resources, less money, less access than we have today. So let's hold ourselves to a higher standard. That's the first thing I would say. That the second is that there's a very profound misunderstanding in our time, which is obsessed with instrumental outcomes about how productivity works. And so we think that it's in the old adage, don't just stand there, do something. And of course, I am not saying that doing things is not important. But if you look at how effective action is taken, it is really premised on clarity of vision. You might say knowledge precedes will. Because just being really busy and doing something without a sense of what you're doing, why, how best to go about it, that's what makes effective action possible. And the paradox is actually that the non-instrumental is prior to and generative of the instrumental. For example, if either Newman or Leibniz or both had not discovered calculus, which was, you might say, an ultimately non-instrumental. I mean, Newman's at Cambridge, at Trinity College, living on a modest fellowship or whatever. He's not wealthy. He discovers calculus. What I'm saying is, without that discovery, and Leibniz, of course, independently, as I understand it, you don't downstream several hundred years later get any of modern computing technology, any of AI, any of the things that depend on algorithms. And so all of this immensely effective stuff that we're now talking about actually depends upon a higher order, not immediately instrumentalized insight. And so even if we were just here to be productive, which I do not believe we will, that would be my third point. Even if we were just about being productive, we need to understand how productivity happens. And in fact, it's a mistake to think that you get productivity without thinking first. Thinking is what productivity depends upon, whether that's a simple task ahead of you that you just need to know clearly how to do it effectively. It's the thought that allows you to approach it, to make the efficient and effective investment of your time and labor. But also that at a higher level, it's the things you discover in and through thinking, the work of contemplation, the work of recollection that falls back upon and gives us access to higher order realities, that later allows us to apply those instincts. That's what the applications are to instrumental problems, challenges, objectives. And then the third and final point I would like to make briefly, David, is that I'm going to divide this into 2 points. 2 points about the humanities. The first is I want to ask the question about what usefulness is. And, I think it needs to be said that things are only useful with regard to a particular end. So, a pencil is very effective for writing something on paper. It's not very useful as a means of transportation. A car is a good means of transportation, but it's not very effective as a means of communication or whatever. You get my point. The door in your house is very good for giving access when you want and not when you don't want, but it really is not very effective as an activity of courtship or something like this. You see what I'm saying? That things have particular ends. And so the question about usefulness, like what are you going to do with that, right? Really, you have to ask yourself, well, what are the ends or uses that you value first? And you might say, well, I'd like to do this because that such and such a course of study I think is going to set me up well for a job, and it'll give me an income, and I need an income in order to support the family I'd like to have and myself in the future. And I think all that adds up brilliantly. That's a good answer. But the trouble is that not everything can be lived for something else. You might say, well, you want that job because you actually value having the family or being able to live life with those that you care for. And so what I'm trying to get at here, David, is that ultimately the question of whether something is useful, it can only be answered relative to what ends you are putting it to. And so what that means is, if you were to zoom out, so to speak, on human life and say, well, what would be the thing that would be of most value? Because surely what would help me do that would be most useful. And I would say that most human beings, and this I think is probably true trans-culturally and also trans-historically, most human beings would like to be able to pass the deathbed test, what I call the deathbed test, which is something like coming to the end of your life, whenever it is, say you have a little bit of warning, you're going to die. And you have a minute to think about how you have lived. Passing the deathbed test is being at that point and saying, I lived the one life I had to live as I should have lived it. And terrible thing it is if you get to that point and you think you have not done that. You've, I don't know, let down those that you most loved, or you squandered your talent or ability or resources, or you failed to live up to the moments in life that this is not my telling someone what their metric should be. I'm just saying what they thought the biggest moments in life were that they needed to come through and live and rise to the occasions of. Terrible thing it would be to really feel that you had negative answers on all of those fronts. But a correspondingly wonderful thing if you could say, I made lots of mistakes, but I feel I've done my best to live truly to the things I regard as most important. Well, if you think that that's true, that being able to pass that test is something, if not the most important thing, then a thing of very, very great value, then the tools that would enable you to pass that test would be of correspondingly highest value. And fundamentally, that's what the humanities are. The humanities are the repository of what other human beings have thought about human experience. And so therefore, they are like bright lights that the past gives us to try to illuminate ourselves, our present, and the future in order to help us live as well as we can. And so I want to overturn what I take to be the assumptions, not yours, but that are fairly dominant, of usefulness, and actually say, damn right, you should approach your education and get something useful out of it. And the most useful thing you could ever get as a human being is some insight into how to live and to live well. That's what the humanities are for. And then the second and final point I would make is actually related to what I was saying about the instrumental being downstream of the non-instrumental. It is true that rightly conceived, a humanities education cannot be subordinated to any particular instrumental outcome. If you read Shakespeare, as I often say, to learn how to sell razors, you're not going to get much out of Shakespeare, and you're probably not going to be very good at selling razors. But if you really read Shakespeare and you spend real time with his plays, you're going to derive some pretty deep insights into how things work, into the nature of human beings, into their interrelations, their foibles and failures and strengths, and so on, that will, in ways that you cannot predict, be immensely useful to you in life. And so this is where people talk about critical thinking and powers of articulation, communication, and expression, analysis, comparison. These are really very, very fundamental skill sets in productivity, in any analysis, whether that's in the sciences, in the arts, in journalism, in any cultural output, but also relative to being a person who's able to tackle, and I mean the most practical questions in life, like how do you navigate your relationships and your marriage, your friendships, your community. How do you solve and approach the really seemingly endless stream of things that you have before you to do and figure out, just as a human being moving through time. And so my claim is that, in fact, and you can look at this, I think it's well supported by the data I've seen about the trajectories of people who study in the humanities, perhaps in certain fields more than others. My claim is that that turns out to be very useful, not just to living life in the biggest, what is a good life, what is virtue, what is truth, what is justice, redemption, and all those things, but also very practically, it makes you a very powerful figure relative to certain kinds of work and challenges, both that are going to be immense value non-monetarily in your relationships and navigating your personal life, but also in the world of productivity, knowledge work, and so on.
And just bouncing off of that point on usefulness. So I'm a musician. My life has been steeped in not only art but classical music. And one of the frustrations that I know a lot of my colleagues have is having to continuously justify why something like the arts or the humanities are important. And I'd be curious to know what you think about this. But I think some of this comes from the way currently in the culture we conceptualize success. Success is often tied to monetary value. It's tied to things. It's tied to stuff. How much money do I have in my bank account? What kind of car do I drive? And I'm not saying any of these things are bad, by the way. Like, it's not wrong to make money. It's not wrong to have really cool things. All of that's fine. But I think about someone like, well, Socrates as an example. Was Socrates successful? Well, Socrates, according to the story, drinks hemlock and dies. Mozart, who's one of the most famous composers ever, dies at I think 33 and is buried in a pauper's grave. He's poor his entire life. Was Mozart successful? And some of this, and again, I want to know what you think about this, comes down to how we define usefulness and success. And you've already elaborated on some of that, but specifically as it pertains to the concepts of success, I would be curious to get your thoughts on that.
It's a really good question, I think. And, I'm not going to sit here and try and prescribe lives for others to live. I think a lot of this does come down to where each individual is genuinely able to discover meaning. And it's rare that has nothing to do with your own talents, your own context, your family, your culture, your country, your time in history. We're not living in a vacuum, so to speak. So I think that discovery does have to do with us in a particular sense. But beyond that, I don't. I suppose what I'm wanting to say is that I think where meaning is found is precisely in discovering your relation to higher order goods. That's, you could say, to put it slightly more tentatively, to things you think are higher order goods, to leave open the question as to whether they're actually kind of metaphysically, definitively real.
Would you mind?
I
I'm
think
sorry.
clearly they are.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Would you mind if we rather interrogate that idea a little bit?
Yeah.
When you say higher order goods, do you mean? I want to be careful how I say this, and oh gosh, how do I say this? Do you mean that in the merely subjective, like I consider this to be good, therefore it is good, or do you mean through our gifts and talents, the meaning that we discover transcends us? If you see what I'm getting at.
Yes. Well, so I'm glad that you've had us pause here for a minute, because I maybe moved a little too quickly between two things. And to be clear, what I am saying is that I think the discovery of meaning is precisely about locating the self. I mean, yourself in relation to things that you consider to be transcendent value. And when I say higher order goods is the words I used, I mean things, truth, beauty, family, justice. So you could say, that one good is in service of a higher one. So I might, want to get a job in order to get money. I might want that money because I want to care for my son. I want to care for my son because I regard him as something of really transcendent reality and truth in my life. This human being that I've been given the chance and the responsibility to steward or care for, and so that transcends my immediacy of my own wants and desires. I subordinate them to something I regard as higher. And it may even be that I regard that by that I'm participating in realities that transcend either of us: love, sacrifice, beauty, duty. That I'm giving myself over to, you might say, the most tectonic principles of the cosmos or truths of the cosmos itself in this relationship that I am subordinating or giving myself freely to. So I believe that meaning is always of this character, that it's finding, discovering your relation to and living in that relationship to these things that you regard as transcendent, and because you regard them as that way, they in that sense are for you transcendent. The next question is whether they are beyond your subjective perception of that. You might say, in a kind of functional way, you could say, well, because I act in this way, for me, this is a transcendent good. But the rejoinder would be, well, that's a personal preference or opinion. And the reason I make this distinction is because I think even if that were your view, it's still clear what the mechanism is. That meaning is found precisely in locating the self in relation to things the self regards as transcendent, and by doing so, they actually become transcendent, because that is how they are being lived in relation to. But the next question is whether they're actually, independent of what quite apart from what the hell I think about it. These are, in fact, actually transcendent realities. And there, I think it depends what we're talking about. But broadly speaking, the answer is definitively yes. I mean, this is not simply a matter of opinion. It is not simply a matter of opinion. As I said recently, stone will be hard and fire will be hot and human beings free, whether we want them to be so or recognize them to be so or not, right? Like, those are just built into the nature of reality. And so what I am, one of the key things we get from the ancient Greeks in particular are deep reflections, philosophical reflections that don't depend on faith, and they don't depend on believing this sacred text or anything like that. I'm not diminishing those traditions. I'm just saying they don't work that way at the level of the axiomatic, you might say, unfolding of the argument from axioms that are self-evident to all human beings. You can come to the knowledge of certain realities, and certainly beauty and being and unity and things of this kind or of that sort. And so I put justice in that category and other matters. So though we don't have a great deal of time today to get into how we might say unfold those arguments, I want to be clear that though I do believe that there's a subjective element to our relation to these things, that is itself, I think, embedded within, you might say, the objective realities of how all these things work. And in fact, our subjectivity has an objectivity to it. That's partly what I'm saying, that it is the case that human beings find meaning in this way. That is not a merely subjective, it's not an opinion. That's a fact. That's how it works. So that's somehow embedded in things that are bigger, deeper, truer, more expansive, independent of us. You might say the objective is that which persists, whether we recognize it to be so or not. And that is in that category. And those goods that we find our meaning in relation to, I would argue, are in that category. And it also is in that category that we are of the nature to do precisely that.
And thank you for nuancing that. One of the things, and I asked with specific purpose. You had mentioned the ancient Greeks and the way they conceptualize this. I always turn back to Plato's theory of forms, at the top of the hierarchy of forms being the good, and how we can recognize certain things that we don't always have good explanations for verbally to explain. And I'm coming at this from a musical perspective. In the 20th century, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, but there was a very famous quote unquote piece of music called 433 by John Cage, which to my mind was the logical conclusion of the postmodern view of music, that music is whatever you want it to be. So why can't it also just be nothing? And 433, for people who don't know, is where you sit at the piano and don't play anything for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And there was a lot of this postmodern adjacent logic towards the interpretation of art. What is art? And one of the things that I've been talking to with other people on this podcast, and outside in college and academia, is that while yes, the way we experience the world is subjective because we experience it through our senses. We might both be looking at the color blue, but I can't know if you see the color blue the same way I see the color blue, something like that. However, the form of certain things we know exists. Like I might not be able to define chair in a perfectly cohesive manner that encapsulates all possible variables of chair. But if I hold a chair in front of you, you will recognize the chair. And from that, we can come to understand, and you correct me if you disagree with any of this, but from that, we can come to understand that while we do experience the world through a subjective lens, that does not mean that everything is merely subjective. And that's usually the terminology I use. It's not merely subjective, that there is an objectivity that goes beyond us. Would you say that that's a fair conception?
Yeah. Well, I think that these are big questions, of course, but I think that and of course, there's a huge amount of territory to cover, and we really live in these. This is sort of the world in which we live. You might say is grappling with the question of our own perceptions, trying to understand those perceptions, but then also understand whether those perceptions are accurate. It matters a lot to us, I would say, and a lot depends upon it. If you misjudge, how far the bus is from you when you're stepping into an intersection, or how deep the water is you're diving into, or whether the person you've just proposed to is going to be a true and faithful and loving person. I mean, a lot depends on, whether our perceptions, no one is ever going to, only an idiot would say that, your feelings are not your feelings, or your perceptions are not your perceptions. There's a circularity. There's an inherent truth to that. If you're feeling this, you're feeling that. No one can say you're not. The question is, to what degree does that map onto reality? And then I think you're helpfully pointing us, David, to the question that is the way in which those two things are bound up. So it's not simply that, all right, here's my feelings or perceptions, and there's reality, because there's a sense in which how we approach what we do also does bring about or determine what we're able to find. Ian McGilchrist writes beautifully about attention in this regard. I'd urge your readers to look up Dr. McGilchrist's work on attention. So that, and we see this, just simple example, if you're grumpy and in a bad mood or cynical or whatever, overtired, it usually doesn't take that long until, your day's not going so well. And then, maybe other people are reflecting back to you like, geez, what's his problem today? And then you do that, you run that experiment long enough, and, your relationships start to deteriorate. Maybe people don't want to spend time with you, and then you find yourself lonely, and then you develop a worldview that's nihilistic. And so you see what I'm saying, that there is, there's an objectivity to the fact that our subjectivity, our perception, our attention does bring about or influence or limit or open up what we're able to find in the world. Now, that is, of course, not to say that the world is totally up to what that reality itself is simply subject to our subjective modes. That whole process is itself governed by higher order realities, whether it's reciprocity or whatever. But it is to say that you have to sort of think about these three things together. Well, what are my perceptions? What's real? And how do my perceptions enable me or disenable me, you might say disable me, to productively, helpfully, happily finding my way in the world? And that's frankly why tending to our own minds or perspectives or souls, or however you might want to put it, is such an important part of life, because so much of the battle of life is psychological in that sense. Like if you tell yourself you're a heap of dung and worthless and not ever going to amount to anything and always doing things wrong, and we can be terrible with ourselves, our own worst enemies, as we often describe it. That's going to have a big and a detrimental effect on you and your life and what you can actually become. Conversely, if you have a good measure of humility and self-criticism, but balanced by maybe a sense of the goodness of reality, or the sense that maybe you're made for something that does matter, that if you patiently, little by little, try and be true to that, and with the right cadences of self-reflection and repentance and reorientation and goal setting and self-examination and all those things that really you might say the spiritual life, that is to say the life of our thinking about ourselves, is made up of, then you've got a shot at something pretty cool, which is living the one life you get as well as you can.
There's so much more to say on this, and I feel bad about pivoting, but we only have so much time. So far, so good. I love talking about these things, but pivoting for a moment. One of the things that I've been working on is reconnecting the arts and the humanities, because to my mind, they're not separate subjects, but they exist in a very symbiotic relationship. For example, and I'm leading this to an analogy I've heard you use several times that I really like, but Beethoven cannot be Beethoven unless he's born in a time and an era that not only wants composers, but provides, let's call it a fertile ground for a composer like Beethoven to exist. If Beethoven is born in the middle of India at the same time period he was in Germany, the results are drastically different. Without things like great architecture with a worldview behind it, without things like great sculptures, great painting, great music, in order for these things to exist in the first place, there must be a worldview and an environment for which these things can thrive. Now, and I'm very sorry to say this, I've only been to Savannah, Georgia once, and it was a long time ago, but I remember it being extraordinarily beautiful. I know Ralston has an extraordinarily beautiful campus, and I've heard you, and I forget exactly the analogy, so you'll have to remind me, but it was the idea of acorns, and an acorn can only grow in a fertile environment. Can you talk a little bit about that, the combination of the arts and humanities, and why they are linked and not separate, if you agree with that conception?
Of course. I'd be happy to. Well, I use the metaphor of the acorn because, well, first of all, here in Savannah, and it is a very beautiful city, and for those of your listeners who've not had the privilege or pleasure of encountering this great city, I welcome them to come down and spend a day here sometime. And look us up when you're here, by the way. One of the defining features of Savannah are these great live oak trees, these mighty, mighty trees, some of them several hundred years old. They're just astonishingly beautiful, powerful, living creatures. And they're balanced in this amazing way, the thousands of tons on one side balanced by the other side, and the top balanced by the roots below, and there are these incredible kind of forces of dialectic in motion or something, or dialectic in stillness somehow, although trees do move. Anyway, the point I'm making is that these great oaks, every season, it's around November, I think, they put off their acorns. They shed their acorns. That's how the way they reseed themselves, obviously. And there's just hundreds of thousands of the acorns underfoot in Savannah. Well, every single one of those acorns is potentially a mighty oak tree. That's what an acorn is. It's an oak tree in potentia. It can't become, an owl or, a piece of machinery in your hard drive. It has a concrete potentiality, but it has that potentiality. It can become an oak tree. But there's nothing inevitable about that acorn becoming an oak. It's not bound to happen. In fact, the fact is, almost none of them become oak trees. Most of them get trodden underfoot, eaten by squirrels, drained down the gutter, whatever. And so most, you might say the realization of that potentiality is only not inevitable. It only happens under certain conditions. And you say, well, what are those conditions? Well, it's something like a good lie in the ground in soil that's conducive to the germination and growth of the acorn into a tree or sapling and then tree. Sunlight, good exposure to the sun, the right amount of rain, and so on. And over many, many years, in fact, over centuries, to achieve the full, you might say, potential of that acorn. And so the point I'm making is that all living things have a concrete or particular potential. They can become what they can become. It's not totally malleable. And there's a range maybe that could become some of this, or it could be somewhere on this scale of realization. But it's still it's concrete, particular, and defined what their potentiality is for, just as the acorn has the potentiality of being an oak. The same is true of all living beings. And like the oak, it is also true that the realization of that potential is not inevitable. And like the oak, it is true that realization can only become actual, its potential actualized, with the right conditions. Now, you can see where I'm going with this. Human beings have a nature, and that nature can only be realized with the right conditions or inputs. Now, human beings, oak trees are they're pretty complicated beings, but human beings are far more complex. And I'm not saying there's any single formula. It's a lot more complicated. But a culture, broadly speaking, the word culture comes from Latin, meaning, where we get the word to cultivate. A culture is, broadly speaking, and agriculture is the cultivation of the soil. So you might say that a culture, in the sense that we think about it, our laws, our political institutions, our architecture, our educational aims, all of this is part of our culture in that sense. A culture is simply the soil that we're living in. And just as you could have soil that would be very bad for oak trees or for tulips or whatever you were trying to grow, apples, oranges, whatever, you could have soil that was good for that plant. You could have soil that was bad for that plant. And so the meta question that I want to pose is, what does a culture look like that's good for the realization of the potential of human beings? And just as with acorns or apple seeds, you can't really answer that question unless you know what the nature of that thing is. You need to know, if you're going to have an apple orchard, you need to know what it is that apple seeds and trees need to achieve their potential, to grow the best apples they can, let's say. And so you need to know when to prune them and what kind of nourishment they need and what sort of sunlight and exposure and rainfall and all that. The same is true of human beings, that you can't really have a culture that's going to have a shot at cultivating the potential of human beings if you don't know what a human being is and what kind of cultivation and opportunity and care they need. And so human beings are, in one sense, they have a shared human nature that's universal. And in another sense, they have very different characteristics, potentialities, opportunities, histories, etc. And so there's no one size fits all dimension to this question. You might say the way to think about it is that you need the range of pathways that can be as adequate as possible to the actual diversity of human beings. But there will probably be attributes that all human beings, just as all oak trees, will need. You can have them foster in any number of different places and climates and so on. But, some stability with respect to love and affection and infancy and childhood is a really important thing. Some kind of education that enables that, we are thinking creatures to be as well equipped to the complexity of reality as we can be. And some laws that provide stability to our charting our course, whether it's pertaining to property or things you're allowed or not allowed to do that create a stability that allows us to unfold our lives, and so on and so forth. What I'm saying, I know this is a long answer, what I'm trying to say here is that human beings have a nature, and our culture is meant to realize that nature. If you think of the oak tree, if you think by another example, you think of a baby horse, a little foal, but then you think about what a horse at full gallop is like, or a bird in full flight. If you think about the thing in its fullest, most beautiful, most realized form, if you think about that for the people you know and love, what you think they would look like, the question is, what context, what challenges, what difficulties, what love, what support, what mediation do they need in order to become that? And that is the question I think we've not been asking very carefully. And it's because I think we do not have anything remotely resembling an adequate anthropology. We really, we have all kinds of ideas about reality and human beings that are incompatible with their realization. And the place I think we need to start is with a serious grasp of what a human being is. And again, I know one can spend a lot of time talking about this from a lot of different angles, but there's also a kind of back of the envelope analysis that I think people would pretty quickly assent to about what a meaningful life looks like. And then you can work back from that to say, okay, well, what does that mean for K-12 education? What does that mean for the kind of architecture we might want to foster? What does that mean for policies that incentivize family life, and so on? So what I'm aiming to describe here is what a culture needs, and I think the question about art and so on fits within this. That the ultimate questions here are about meaning in human life, and the arts are one of the most powerful ways we have into grappling with our consciousness and with our relation to what is most real and abiding, and to our reconciliation with the difficulty of that. One of the things the arts do, perhaps most importantly, is reconcile our finite, broken stops and starts, our failures, our limits. Somehow they place that with and open that up onto and reconcile that with a horizon of intelligibility, beauty, love, even eternity.
Pivoting again, and this is more of a logistical question about not only your work, but your role as president of Ralston. I have, in preparation for this conversation, I was going through some of your work, your conversation on the Trigonometry podcast. You have moderated conversations with very famous intellectuals, Sir Roger Scruton, the late Sir Roger Scruton being one of probably the most influential, I think, in so many ways of my thinking. You have participated in panels like the Daily Wire had hosted the Exodus seminar as well as the Gospel seminar. And by the way, on that point for a moment, I just thought about this. So I recently I've recently had a son. My son is now 3.5 weeks old. So
Oh, congratulations.
thank you. It's not to go on a tangent, but I've now fully, or I say fully, I've better come to understand the difference between intellectual knowledge and experiential knowledge. Because while my wife was giving birth, intellectually, I knew it was going to be horrible. But it's sort of like that meme in The Office. In one sense, I knew what to do, but in a much more real sense, I had no idea what to do. And it was an insane experience. Um,
Mm.
and yes, you had said something. I forget which seminar it was, but it was the idea of giving your children back to God. While your children are a gift, they are not yours, and that's been very helpful. Less helpful for my wife right now. She's not quite there, but that was well said, and that stuck with me. And I just wanted to tell you that I appreciated what you had said. That
Well, it's
resonated.
kind of you to say, and there's different, perhaps fathers and mothers have somewhat different relations, or sometimes very different relations, and it's right that they do at different times.
Mm,
And well, yeah, I have no doubt that your wife is giving herself to your son completely.
of course. Um, but having participated in these events in these talks, first, how do you prepare for very, how do I say this? When I say difficult, I don't mean in the negative sense. I mean that the sort of like we've been doing, the questions that are brought up are very complex and can be unpredictable. The conversations, you don't know where they're going to go, so it's hard to prepare for something like that. But then, being the president of Ralston College, does that affect the way that you? And again, I mean this in the positive sense, but does this affect the way that you behave, as you are not acting just as an individual, but as a representative of the institution that you are steering?
Well, maybe there's two questions there, and the first is that I do take my role as the president of the college very seriously, or I hope I do. I try to, and I I I try to remember that I am in a way a representative of the college, and so yes, I do think about that, and yeah, and it's probably the case that there are some conversations I would have more easily if I were not in this situation, just as there are conversations I am able to have because I am. So, but I do try to take that very the responsibility of that seriously. Not that I have always lived up to it as I would like to. It's important to have ideals, um, uh, precisely because one will not. What I'm trying to say is that there's a I'm certainly not making the claim that I've held to this as or any of my ideals as perfectly as I would like. We all make mistakes, but I do try to think about it. And the second thing I would say, you asked about preparation.
Mm,
I would say a couple of things. The first is that the deep preparation for me is the life I've lived up until this point, and I have had the privilege to spend quite a bit of time thinking about certain deep questions, let's say, and so that's always in the background for me. It's one of the ways in which a serious education is a perennial gift in one's life. Is that if you've spent time? I was saying this earlier about the usefulness of what seems useless. I spent quite a bit of time thinking about the nature of human being or the soul, and the nature of the first principle or God, or however you might want to put it. Not that I consider myself any kind of, famous or world historic important scholar on those things. I've just been a small, a relatively small mind thinking about these things as best as I can. But I have invested a lot of time in that, and with teachers who took me seriously and enabled me to go as far as I could in those questions. And so I did a lot of deep work in that, is what I'm saying, and that's the first thing. And the second is that though I have myself, to greater or lesser degree at different times, been able to live this out, I do find that, of course, particular preparation is important. It's important to know what are you going to be talking about and to prepare for talking about that. But I have found, and I'm just speaking personally, that it's often important to approach conversations with intention, but also to, we were saying earlier, but one of the big battles can be psychological. It in my experience at least, and maybe other people are very different, it's good to be centered and thoughtful, and to be trying to collect yourself, and not just to run in and jump into it, but to take a minute to collect yourself, maybe a long minute. Rest can be important. It depends on the stakes. But if I had if I was doing a big interview, it would be best not to be out too late the night before, or to have too many stresses in my life. Now, the reality is always impinging on our great plans. So I'm well aware of the need to improvise or to make the most with what you've got. But I would say, as general rules of thumb, three things. The first is the deep work of preparation. The second is the intention and presence, and then the third, which is related to that, is that it's really not about you. It's about the content that you're trying to get at, the questions, the problems, whatever it is. That if it's in this context, it's being recorded. That's for, you hope, that can be helpful to others. And so I think if you can focus on that, then that will help. And then finally, I would say I do think that not everything makes its way into camera, and one of the challenges of our time is figuring out as well as we can, what the limits of what the recorded things are, while also trying to make them as helpful and as good as we can.
With the rise of AI, quote unquote art, AI generated images and AI generated videos, it's harder for people to tell what is real online more and more, and it's probably going to continue and probably get worse before it gets better. But the positive side, and I really do believe this is the case, is that people are going to actually get out more and have to go out and find things that are real. And one of the amazing things about Ralston is the traveling that you all do. It's hands-on, in-person, in interacting in a manner that most colleges are not invested in. Now, one of the other questions I wanted to ask you, and I wanted to ask you again because you're the president, but because I've noticed a lot of other institutions have struggled with this, is hosting speakers, hosting lecturers, guest lecturers that are controversial in one form or another. The and I should preface, I am a fan of these people and their work, but I have also seen just general controversy come up whenever they're associated with anything. People like doctors Brett and Heather Weinstein. Douglas Murray made waves recently with his appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast. As the president of the college, how do you approach bringing on guest speakers, and how do you balance what could be negative publicity with speakers that you would like to host at your institution? Or are there any negative things that come about that at all?
Well, it's a good question, and let me maybe share a few reflections. The first thing I would say is that we do try quite hard to be true to the things that we say we're about. And so the college has defined itself around four fundamental realities or values, commitments, let's say. The first is to the truth, to seeking the truth wherever it leads. Can't be a university worthy of the name if that's not your fundamental mission. Second, to freedom, in particular to the freedoms that the pursuit of truth depends upon: freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry, but also freedom of association, freedom of conscience. Third, to the apprehension of beauty in all of its forms. And fourth, to the fellowship or friendship, the community that enables us to seek these things. On our own, we need others to help us, but also together as a shared enterprise. So, we're interested in people who can help us do that. And the college has no religious or political commitments. It has it's no denominational affiliation. No, it's not affiliated with a political party of any kind. So we, there's things we're trying to live out the things that we're about. And again, I'm not saying we've done that. You're always trying to do that better, but we have tended, not to be in the direction of questions simply of the moment or of politics or our current geopolitical or immediate cultural landscape. What's happening this week in the news. Those. I'm not saying those are not important things. So we try to be responsive to the world we're in a big way, but we're not reacting moment to moment. And so when we have someone to campus, it's likely they're going to be sharing thoughts that are perhaps pertain to our moment, but that have perennial value. We had a guest lecturer on Bernini's Four Rivers Fountain in the Piazza Navona in Rome. We had a lecture on Flannery O'Connor and one of her great short stories. We've had, so you get the picture. Of course, sometimes we do bring in people who have a particular, they're well known, and we're very fortunate to be able to do that because their stature helps people learn about what we're doing. But we aim to bring them in on a basis that is true to us. We had the privilege of having Brett Weinstein and Heather Hying here as our Sophia lectures this year, but our theme this year was nature, and so we were having them speak. I mean, they're both distinguished evolutionary biologists, and they gave two great lectures each, and we're looking forward to sharing those with the world. We've had any number of people come to campus. Typically, they're quite scholarly people, even if they're people who have a larger stature or platform in the world at large. Typically, if we have someone coming to lecture in our program, it's because they're an expert in something that we are covering with the students. That's what a university is. We're pursuing and conveying knowledge of a certain kind, and we aim to do that as rigorously as we can. I suppose what's in your question is how one navigates, hot potato topics or people, and I think what we've tried to do is to be true to us, and we're grateful for those who've come to visit us, who've been able to make the world aware of what Ralston is. But we're not subordinating Ralston College, at least this is how I think about what we're doing and not doing, to any particular instrumental end or political end or economic end or social engineering end. The college is meant to stay at a level of the higher order, and we try to live true to that. Of course, we're always, hopefully we're better at doing that now than we were in our first year. And we, in any startup venture, you're constantly iterating and trying to think about how best to do what you are setting out to do and how you can improve what you're doing. And I think maybe I'll just say quickly that I do also think that we're culturally at a moment in which this can be a difficult balance to keep, because there's such a rancorous and politically charged moment. And I think one of the questions is, how do you speak to that moment, but without falling into the reductions and lazy and unhelpful oppositions that so often characterize our public life and our cultural intellectual conversation. And we at least aspire to think very carefully about where we are in our time in history, but also to step outside of it with a wider lens and to be able to allow voices of wisdom and insight from a millennia or 2 millennia or 500 or 300 years ago, or voices of music or images of beauty or the complexity of things that can be relayed in images, and to sort of locate our conversation in that long arc. And I think that is actually the best way we can speak to what's most contested and difficult in our time, is to try and get some perspective so we can see and attend to it as best as we can.
We're running short on time, so I have two final, very brief questions. First one is a bit silly, but it's for me because I'm a musician and I really love Ralston College. Is there a music program or a development of music that will be happening anytime in Ralston's future?
Well, we have, what do we have? We have, first of all, we do have our students listen to certain works of music as part of the curriculum. This year they listened, I believe, they did the Ring Cycle of Wagner.
Oh, wow. Okay.
We also had some chamber music performed for them one night as part of one moment in the curriculum. We have 2 concerts a year that we have had historically, one around Christmas and one in the sort of midwinter. And those have been performed by both a mix of professional singers and of our own students. We have had the privilege of having a very talented musician work with our with students who are interested on a voluntary basis and develop the Ralston Chorus. And so the chorus has sung under her direction in these concerts. So we have opportunities for them to sing with not curricularly but extracurricularly, and some requirement, you might say, depending on the curriculum year to year, where they actually engage with, and not as expert musicologists, but as a work of a substantial cultural work of art that has come down to us through the centuries, that has stood the test of time. And so that's been worked in. We don't have any formal music program. We only have the one-year MA in the humanities, but music does play some role, both in the formal curriculum and, let's say, in the college life in an extracurricular way.
And then the last question, and this is the question I'm workshopping to be the ending of the next 10 episodes. What is something practical from this conversation that you would like people to take away? If people only remembered one thing, unfortunately, what is a way that they can apply this conversation practically?
Very simply, and this is, I might say I'm saying this to myself as much as to anyone listening. Take the time to think about what matters to you, how you want to live, and how you can best do that. But give yourself the space and the time, the freedom to really think about it, to care for your soul, to care for others, to think. Take the time to think, to whether it's in the mornings or it's on a walk, whether it's your workout or your prayer time or your time in quiet reflection, whatever character that might be. A man I really admire and whose books have been a great help to me is named Cal Newport. He wrote a book called Deep Work, and another one, Digital Minimalism, another one now, Slow Productivity, I think it's called, amongst others. And one thing that Newport says is that if living our time intentionally is so important, then, and that's one of his big points, then you need to take time to plan your time. And you might say, if living your life well is perhaps the thing that matters to you more than anything, then take time to think about how to do that. We're living in an age that doesn't, in a way, value that. So take time to do that and listen to yourself and seek the wisdom of others, and that'll, I think, help you go about it in the best way that you can.
Dr. Stephen Blackwood, thank you so much for your time. I'm really looking forward to people watching this conversation. And best of luck with everything at Ralston. Hopefully, I'll find some time. I was actually planning on traveling to listen to one of the Sophia lectures, but I had an orchestra conflict, and so I couldn't come. But I'll try and be at one of the next Ralston events, and I'm looking forward to seeing all the work that you continue to do. Thank you.
Well, you'll be most welcome. I appreciate the work you're doing, and all the best to you and your wife and your new little one.